If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, so this is our first video in the introductory video to the verbal reasoning fundamentals lesson. So, what exactly is verbal reasoning? Well, according to the LSAT, the test measures your reading and comprehension of complex texts, your ability to think critically, and the analysis and evaluation of reasoning and arguments. And the questions in the argument section are actually based on the reasoning contained in them, and on the reading comprehension section on info that is stated or implied. So, if we look at the basic information behind verbal reasoning fundamentals, the argument and the reading comprehension section require a good understanding of verbal reasoning, whereas the logic games, that section, requires more of an understanding of abstract or symbolic reasoning. Now, verbal reasoning is the type of reasoning that is more everyday, and it appears in arguments, in everyday arguments, and verbal reasoning that is tested for an LSAT has analogs in key elements of legal practice. So this lesson we're focusing more on, like I said, the verbal as opposed to the symbolic reasoning that we'll find in the games. So it has key elements in legal practice, and that's things like evidence evaluation, rule-based reasoning, policy considerations, etc. And as I said, abstract reasoning is more symbolic and deals with more abstract relationships between things. That's more of the logic games, and we'll see that in the logic game sections. So to do well on the arguments and on the reading comprehension, so you need to have a good understanding of verbal reasoning. Specifically, what exactly is it fundamentally? So what is verbal reasoning? What does it look like? How do we identify it? What are the common variations? So how can we see the different ways in which it's presented? And also, very importantly, how does it connect to legal practice? So these are all the things that we're going to cover introductory in this video, and in more depth and detail in the remaining videos for this lesson. Okay, so what exactly is verbal reasoning? So we see, as I say here, verbal reasoning involves arguments, and I have here two paragraphs. The first one says John is studying for the LSAT, therefore John is going to do well on the LSAT. And the second says John is studying for the LSAT and John also works part-time. So those are two different paragraphs, and we're going to go in a little bit detail in terms of trying to understand what all this means for verbal reasoning. Now, for something to be an argument, there must be at least two statements, and one supports or leads, you can think of that the same thing, supports or leads, to the other statement. And a statement is simply a claim that can be either true or false, and to support means that if one is true, if one statement is true, then the other is likely to be true as well. In other words, it gives you a reason to accept it as true or to believe it. So one statement gives you a reason to accept it as true or to believe it. Without these relationships of support, there is no argument. And so we can kind of start to see what the difference now is between these two paragraphs. Here we see they both have two different pieces of information. They have two statements. So the first statement here is that John is studying for the LSAT in this first paragraph. And the second statement is that therefore John is going to do well in the LSAT. Same thing here. We've got two statements. John is studying for the LSAT, and then John also works part-time. But it seems like the first one has that relationship of support. It's because John is studying for the LSAT, because you know that's true, that gives you reason to think that he's going to do well in the LSAT. Whereas in this one, the fact that he's studying for the LSAT doesn't really seem to have any relevance for whether or not he works part-time. Okay, so we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in a second. So looking at a little bit more detail in terms about what we just talked about, like I said, arguments will always be about two fundamental things. Or rather, in a little bit more detail, arguments will be about two fundamental things. So the statement that is supported by other statements. That's the first fundamental thing. You want to find that statement which is supported by the others. And that is generally called the conclusion. That's the main point. That's what the author wants you to accept or what they want you to believe. Now, an argument could have multiple conclusions, but on the test, you pretty much always have only one or one main one. Okay, so that's the first thing. Remember I said argument always has two statements, and you can think of it as that breaking down into two fundamental things, and one of those two fundamental things is the conclusion to an argument. And going back to an argument here, John is going to do well on the LSAT is the conclusion, because that is what is supported by the fact that he's studying for the LSAT. That's what makes this an argument. This is the conclusion. John is going to do well on the LSAT. We do not have that here. There is no conclusion here. There is no reason to accept that John works part-time because they're studying or vice versa. Whereas here we do have that. Okay. The other thing, the other fundamental thing is that you will have statements that present information about something and are used as support for the conclusion. And these are generally called premises. And you can think of them as reasons that the author gives to get you to accept the conclusion. So these could be simple or complex, and they're generally called evidence or premises. And a premise is just is a name for an individual statement. And here we can see that that is this particular statement, that John is studying for the LSAT. It's because John is studying for the LSAT that's a reason, that's something that makes you more likely to accept that John is going to do well on the LSAT. Okay, so once again, we see how this very simple argument breaks down into those two fundamental aspects of all arguments. There is the statement, therefore John is going to do well on the LSAT, which is the conclusion, which is what the author wants you to accept or believe. And there's a statement, John is studying for the LSAT, which is the premise, which is the reason that the author gives, or the reason that you have for accepting that John is going to do well on LSAT. Once again, we don't have any of that here. There is no relationship in this second one. And that's what's going on here, that non-arguments will not have relationships of support. They will simply list out information. So there won't be any premises, there won't be any conclusion, and there will only be statements that describe some situation. And that's what, like I said, what we have down here. John is studying for the LSAT, John works part-time. That is just a description of what's going on with John. Whoever tells this to us is not giving us any reason for accepting either of these statements. Okay, so the first and fundamental aspect of evaluating arguments is to determine what is the conclusion and what are the premises. Okay, so that's what you need to know. Arguments have conclusions and premises, and the very first thing you're doing when you're dealing with an argument is you're identifying what is what. Okay, now, like I said, this relationship of support between the premise and conclusion is central to the argument. So that's the key thing. That's that relationship. So essentially, how do we get from premise to conclusion? We know there's a premise and conclusion. Now we're trying to figure out what is their relationship. What is it about the premise that gets us to the conclusion? So like I said, the evidence is information about something, and conclusion is also information about something. And the argument itself is about that connection or association between those two. So the information that the evidence presents implies or expresses a connection with the information in the conclusion. And there's lots of different ways in which premises lead to conclusion. So you first identify premise and conclusion. Now we're thinking, well, what exactly is it that gets us from one to the other? So in this simple example here, that John is studying for the LSAT, therefore John is going to do well in the LSAT. Well, we can say, well, studying generally means that you are learning something which is important. You're learning how to do something. You're developing the skills for something. So if John is developing the skills for the LSAT, then because he has more skills, he's going to do well on the LSAT. So studying is going to cause you to do well. So this is actually something we'll get into in a lot more detail in this lesson and in others. But that's basically what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that association and looking at it a little bit more carefully, trying to figure out what it is that connects the premises and conclusion. Okay, so with respect to this relation, the key thing is to recognize what the premises are talking about and what the conclusion is talking about and analyzing their association. And that's essentially what I did here with respect to thinking about in terms of causality, that one causes the other. And there's different ways, and like I said, we'll get into more detail, but that's what I'm talking about when I say that you're trying to recognize what that association is. So the premises, and the key thing to remember is the premises and conclusion will always be about different things. So here the premise is talking about studying and the conclusion is talking about doing well. And you want to ask yourself, is it reasonable to accept the conclusion because the premises are true? So once again, in this case, straightforward, it seems very reasonable. You are studying, you're building the skills for something, so you're going to have a better performance in that thing. And that's, like I said, what you're trying to ask yourself, basically, what is the relationship between that association? Okay? So this is fundamentally what is going on with verbal reasoning. In the remaining lessons, in the remaining videos in this lesson, we're going to go into a lot more detail about all of the things that we covered here today. What is a conclusion? What is a premise? What are the different ways that they can appear? What is their association? What are the different ways in which the premise leads to the conclusion? How do we identify that? How do we evaluate that? Okay, so this is the introduction. We covered the basic overview of what verbal reasoning is, the type of reasoning that's important for the arguments in reading comprehension section. And in the remaining videos, we're going to deal with the specifics of all of that stuff in a lot more detail.